Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During consideration of the FY 2024 NDAA, Representative Jacobs and I argued for the prohibition of the transfer of cluster munitions. This amendment would stop the further transfer of cluster munitions. Cluster munitions have caused grave harm to combatants and non-combatants alike. According to the New York Times, since World War II, cluster munitions have killed an estimated 56,000 to 86,000 civilians. According to an Intercept article published on July 5th of 2023, a Ukrainian woman living in the town of Izum, then occupied by invading Russian troops, was killed in a shelling launched by the Ukrainian military. Human Rights Watch, which visited the scene of the attack, said that the death was caused by a cluster munition. A detailed report by Human Rights Watch and echoed by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs stated that cluster munition attacks killed or wounded around 1,000 people in 2022, of whom 890 were in Ukraine, and 95% of whom were civilians. In 2022, there was a total of at least 185 casualties from cluster munition remnants, not the actual explosion of the bomb, but the remnants in Azerbaijan, Iraq, Laos, Lebanon, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. Children accounted for 71% of all these casualties. My friends, the civilized world has stopped producing and transmitting cluster munitions. The United States is an outlier in this respect. These munitions are indiscriminate. They largely are killing civilians. This should not be a part of how the United States conducts warfare. We should not be a follower here, and we should lead. And I appreciate my colleague, Ms. Jacobs, and my colleague, Mr. McGovern, for helping me out on the other side of the aisle on this one. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
In an ideal world, I completely agree. And if we could get every other country in the world to agree to not use these, I'm there. I think it's a place we ought to go, and I think the U.S. ought to be very cautious about where we send them, and we have been. The only place in the world right now we're sending them is Ukraine. And it's because it is a unique set of circumstances where they are under attack by an enemy that, again, is using cluster munitions and all manner of weapons that jeopardize the civilian population. Cutting Ukraine off at this point only gives Russia a further ability to prosecute that war. So I oppose this amendment, and if you support Ukraine in their fight against Russia, you should oppose it as well. I yield back.
Chair agrees with the ranking member's remarks. Chair now recognizes Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I respectfully disagree with you and my ranking member. Most U.S. allies, including most NATO members, have signed on to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. And I think it's a real mistake that the United States hasn't. These weapons maim and kill civilians indiscriminately. In fact, studies have shown that 2/3 of those who are killed are children. And it's because these don't really look like weapons when they're unexploded. They look interesting to kids, they're bright colors. So when kids find these weapons in trees, in water, or simply on the ground, they try to pick them up and can end up losing a limb or their life. And while I appreciate all of the guardrails that have been put in place by the Ukrainians on how they're using these weapons, I don't think any amount of guardrails for cluster munitions are enough. We need to ban the transfer of these weapons entirely. Our partners and allies expect us to do the right thing and protect civilians, especially kids. Now is our chance to actually live up to that reputation, to live up to our values, to live up to the why we are different from the people we are fighting. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Representative Gaetz' amendment and appreciate his and Representative Jacobs' leadership on this. You know, there were 123 countries in Geneva recently about cluster munitions, many NATO allies, many democracies, and they issued a rebuke to 3 countries, to Russia, to Ukraine, and to the United States of America. Now, I am all for defending Ukraine, and I have voted for aid, but not at any price, not at any cost, not at the moral credibility of the United States of America. I don't want to be dragged into the level that it's compromising our moral leadership in the world. And why are we getting rebuked, the greatest country in the world, and being dragged in with countries like Ukraine and Russia? We're a far greater nation. We shouldn't be sinking to those standards. And the reality is, anyone who's read about the issue there, it's because the challenge is Ukraine doesn't have enough artillery Giving them a few more cluster bombs isn't going to change that fundamental deficit that they have. They're getting outproduced 6-1. You know, I'm always made fun of as the one guy who votes against the defense budget on this committee. But my one question is, how are we getting to $1 trillion and we can't produce enough artillery to give Ukraine? So I appreciate the Representative Gaetz' amendment, and I'll be voting yes.